That's weird. Maybe because we just
from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She'll be talking about ethanol production, bee kills, and implications to beekeepers. Judy, thank you for making the trip all the way from Nebraska.
Yeah, I mean,
Thank
it is
you.
my pleasure. It's kind of like coming home. So for those of you who are not familiar, I did my master's here with Steve Shepard, like early 2000s.
Go
Then,
Cougs.
huh?
Go Cougs.
Huh?
Go Cougs.
Yeah, exactly. First time I was introduced to cheese in a can. It's good stuff though. So if you are interested in some of that work, I will be talking a little bit of that in tomorrow's talk when we talk about integrated pesticide management. So this is kind of a depressing talk. I'm just going to put that out there right now. This is something that, oh, there we go. This is something that, you know, I started my position in University of Nebraska-Lincoln in 2015 and started keeping bees there on some of the research properties, and it was just unsuccessful. A lot of my previous work has been related with pesticides, looking at residue accumulation in comb, looking at how neonicotinoids and other chemicals can impact the bees. And I'd like to kind of start with this, just kind of summarizing some of these things. The acute lethal exposures that cause individual bee death, and then that yields these die-offs, these are considered these pesticide kills. We often refer to them as bee kills. But often these new chemistries and the mixtures of chemistries that we're used to seeing now, they often yield kind of chronic or sublethal exposures. Yeah, meaning, can you hear me? Or are you just waving? Meaning that these are oftentimes chemicals or impacts that can alter behavior, development, reproduction in the habitat in ways that can reduce their successful overwintering and their foraging and their just normal colony functions. So often I'm trying to kind of change our perspective on the terminology and the language, meaning that this is often bee kills, pesticides, the regulatory protection policies mainly focus on whether or not it kills the bees or not. Whereas now I'm calling these pesticide incidences, where there's an exposure event that might cause these alterations that might make them less successful overwintering or make them more susceptible to other pests and pathogens. And there's a lot of research that can support some of this. When we were at, when I entered Nebraska, there was still some really strong interest in looking at dust contamination in treated seeds. So this would be neonicotinoids and fungicides, insecticides and fungicides that are coated to the seed itself, and then it's planted. And so one of the concerns is that during the planting, a lot of the residues are kicked up in the dust and kind of penetrating the landscape, blanketing wildflowers and other sources that the bees might go into, including the water sources. Some of the major concerns is that there are limited resources in the spring when planting is happening. So if you are limiting their forage and that what is there is contaminated with pesticides, then that could cause and exacerbate some of their decline. So I had a PhD student in this location looking at just that. If we are encouraging people to plant pollinator habitat, we also want to make sure that that is clean and not contaminated, not acting as a pesticide sink, where then it's going to attract all these pollinators and then they become more exposed. So she was looking at the role of tree lines, existing drift barriers to protect from planting that dust plume, so we can better secure the pollinator habitats and the waterways. She was not looking at specifically ethanol production and impacts on that. But when we started to put habitat in this location, I'm sorry my videos are choppy, there's really big files. We couldn't keep bees in this location. This is a research site that Marion Ellis, if you know of him, has kept bees there for decades, really successfully. You would talk to me about which sites were really good honey producing sites, and all of the sites he recommended, I couldn't keep any bees alive. They just kept spilling out like this very characteristic bee kills. Interestingly enough, the bees themselves did not show any red flags in terms of pesticides. And oftentimes, when they're in those dead bee traps, they can be degraded, the pesticides can be degraded, so that testing is not as reliable as we'd like. Inside the colonies, you're seeing a lot of discolored larvae, dead pupae, just removed brood, signs of crud. How many have seen crud? It was just everything kind of a cocktail of things. This video is really choppy, I'm sorry. Here, actually. So the bees right here are kind of moving in this erratic pattern and they're jittering. And what's really interesting is if you can look inside the cells themselves. They're showing brood disease, but they're also sitting on empty cells. The brood is not being well fed. So when you have a colony that's in decline, it's very difficult to discern whether or not it's directly from the chemical or it's because brood care and the quality of food is no longer up to snuff. So a lot of this, these young larvae are sitting on empty cells. So am I seeing brood losses because of the pesticide, or is it because of the lack of brood care? And that's a really kind of challenging aspect in terms of the research side of things. So we started to do a lot more work just trying to understand why are these bees dying. These pink dots are where these apiaries are. We have this whole research site. It's about 9,300 acres. This is the ethanol plant. It is about 1.5 miles from my honey house. Yay. And these green markers are just kind of the areas where there are intermittent and continuous waterways. And we started to suspect that it was coming from the waterways because we were testing these plants and we were finding milkweed leaves with levels as high as 3,000 to 5,000 parts per billion. It takes about 40 to kill a bee if you're feeding them orally. And this is neonicotinoids or the systemic cocyanidin. So we contested those results because that is unheard of in terms of plants, in terms of milkweed plants. But you notice that when we started looking at where the position of these milkweeds were, the highest levels were associated with the waterways, whereas you went in 30 yards towards the field, counter to our hypothesis, there was actually less of the pesticide or the presence of those residues. So we reached out to the state officials to try to figure out what exactly is happening. Surprisingly, despite all the video and documentation of the losses, they're unable to assist with bee kill investigations. And I think this is a really important point to let beekeepers know. And this is a clear-cut case where you have bee kills just spilling out your hives. But they can't help me because pollinator protection policies are under FIFRA. And without going into a long drawn story, they can't help me because my bees didn't die from the misuse of a pesticide application. There's no farmer or entity that is misusing the compound. This is due to pollution that is entering the waterway and the residues are moving into the soil and into the vegetation. And so the resources were not being allocated because it wasn't specifically a FIFRA problem. So then the onus is on us to determine where their bees are getting exposed to, at which levels, where the chemicals are, and where. Part of the challenge I want to talk to you guys about is this exemption. This is part of the reason why we have such a messy problem. Treated seeds, pesticide-treated seeds, are classified as pesticide-treated articles. Those are exempt from pesticide regulation. The regulation and all the scrutiny happens when the chemical is applied to the seed. Once it leaves the company, it's no longer under that umbrella of regulatory requirements. So that is part of the problem with this story is that this facility right here, and I'll show you pictures of it, was processing pesticide-treated seeds to make ethanol, but it was never designated a pesticide product going into that facility. So there's no requirements for containment. There's no requirements for monitoring. And that is a huge problem. After meeting with the Department of Ag and EPA, he commented that I had too few colonies out there. So I put more out there to show them that every time we put more colonies out, within a week, this is the die-off that we're seeing. These are the other sites that we have research and teaching hives, very, very low weekly losses. This is weekly. So I started to reach out once they told me that there was this ethanol production facility shuttling treated seed into the facility and started reaching out to everybody we knew. And this is something that was really not on anybody's radar. I mean, treated seeds has been on the market since the 90s, but no one has really actually looked into disposal methods. This is how normal ethanol processing should occur. They get harvested grains, it goes through milling, it goes through cooling, it goes through all these processes. But this is the route that gets blended into ethanol. What I wanted to show you is through that process, they create solid waste. That solid vegetative waste oftentimes is processed into livestock feed. They call it distiller's grain, wet distiller or wet cake. There's also a liquid waste that then is shuttled into other products as well. But when there are residues, when there are pesticide contaminants, they cannot feed it to livestock. So this company found a way to advertise it as soil conditioners, liquid and solid, so that the farmers can put it on their fields. Yeah, it gets worse, trust me. Here's an image of the lagoon that was collecting this feed fluid. They're producing 100 gallons of pesticide-laden product, and they're just stockpiling the wet cake, the vegetative wet cake, anywhere on the property that they could. Some of the levels are pretty astonishing. We're talking, 100,000, 50,000 parts per billion in these neonicotinoid insecticides. When I started to reach out and they told me about this facility, I followed the waterways and came to this. This is one of their stockpiles of the wet cake. It's about 7 to 9 feet tall. It's a huge, huge pile of waste. You can see the coloration from that coating. And notice how much water is underneath there, just puddling, no liner underneath. And I really started asking around, like, how does disposal typically happen? Who knows how the proper way to dispose? Because this is clearly not a good idea. And it was really shocking that a lot of them were not very familiar with it. This facility ended up over their 3-4 year term, 10-year of doing this, ended up with 3 piles of solid wet cake and 3 lagoons that are pesticide laden. You can actually see them from a Google satellite, the tinting of that coloration. So then, even though the plant was getting in trouble and had lots of violations, these are hoses that stretch 3 to 5 miles, and they were land applying the liquid as that soil conditioner product. This is what it looks like inside this hoop house. I show this because this is not surplus treated seed from farmers. This is surplus treated seed from suppliers. These are non-viable, no longer germinating, no longer marketable, so they have to get rid of it somehow. And this is what it looks like. And this is still in there. They don't know what to do with it, so it's still in there. This is some of the pesticide reports from the wet cake itself. So here's images of them just kind of putting it on the farms. It's estimated that about 33,000 tons of it was applied to local farms in Nebraska. There are several fungicides and herbicides present in addition to those clothianidin, which is that systemic insecticide. The toxicity of those mixtures are really unknown, but those levels are extremely high. The Nebraska Department of Ag stopped their use of this because they claim that an application was 85 times higher than the maximal annual field load allowed by a typical registered pesticide label. Now, of course, this is not a pesticide because of the exemption. So now a lot of this is there's a lot they're trying to relanguage or think about how to language it. Despite our red flag raising, as late as August of 2020, they were still advertising, I love this, green recycling program. And that they basically were self-touting that they are collecting nearly 98% of all discarded seed in North America. Think about how much corn and soy and ag is planted. A lot of these seeds have these pesticide treatments on it. The company was getting $0 for it. It was just the cost of transport. So it's a good deal for the industry because they got to get rid of it anyways. When we finally started to kind of bring this out to the media, The Guardian was the first journalist to pick it up. And Terry Gillum actually had really kind of a personal connection because in, what was it, in 2008 or 7, this facility was proposing a closed circuit loop. So it's right next to a feed, meat cattle, basically. The cattle was supposed to fuel the ethanol production. Ethanol production was supposed to yield distillers grain to then feed back to the cattle. So it was going to be a closed circuit loop. And that failed. And somehow the company decided, well, we can't get enough grain to make this profitable. How can we get an alternative? And in 2015, they started accepting treated corn seed. Although their permits all said that they were processing corn, it didn't specify that it was corn seed. So that a lot of the permits were just kind of, okay, things are going great. And it wasn't until all of the community members reporting respiratory issues, horrendous smells, dead geese, sick dogs. So the company got shut down in January 2021, and then they had a huge burst of their equipment, and it shed more of this pesticide sludge down the way. There's been a lot of journalists that have been trying to figure out exactly how much has been processed through this facility, and their interest is really on figuring out where's it all going. Because it's been shut down for over a year now, but we really don't know where this huge amount of seed is now being disposed. And that, I think, is some real national implications, because how is it? How do
Take the
I
clicker thing out.
take the clicker thing out?
Oh, there you go.
There we go, I just wiggled it.
Oh,
I wiggled it the wrong way.
There can be better.
No, the wiggling is the.
I don't think it's me.
Is it?
I'll let Brandon take care of it.
Oh, maybe because you set your
Is it, is
lap
that
up on
because
the
I?
control.
That could be.
If you
Or it could just be.
Could just be a scrappy
faulty system.
projector. That's pretty.
Yeah, it's possible. So, yeah, there you go. Here's Marian Ellis. Look how beautiful this is. He did an awesome job seeding this landscape with sweet clovers and alfalfas and fletches and all sorts of different things. And this is what I came across. You know, I was doing a lot of snooping in the bushes a lot of these years. This is one of those. This is one of those lactate piles, real close to where I think the predominant runoff was happening. This is pre-rain, and this is post-rain. Yeah. So some of the things that they were doing to mitigate this runoff are these soil berms. However, I have some real issues with the structural integrity of these berms, because every time it rained, it just washed away, and then they come by and reform it. So it looks like it's doing something, but I don't think it's actually functioning in the way that it's supposed to. So they have since moved that pile, the 3 piles, into 1 pile, which is something. But this is, unfortunately, the video is jumpy, but this is how the volume of water that comes out in these rains. And I show this because this is at the top end of the facility. That river floods and travels 6 miles down to a private farm, and I'll show you his pond. But he had total fish kills for multiple years as a result of it. And the Department of Environment and Energy have installed these plugs in the culvert systems to inflate, to stop the flow, if that were to happen. And unfortunately, I don't know how effective it is in some of these things, because when they block the culvert, then it floods into the landscape. And then you've got these big pulled areas where then the birds stop and kind of feed and wade for a couple hours, and then they leave. So what is the impact of that kind of exposure on migratory birds for a couple hours? We don't know, because they move and they're not something that's easily studied. But there is significant concerns there on their ramifications on the bird population. This is the site itself. Here's that pond, that private pond, 6 miles down. Here are all my beehives. Yay, lucky me. And then here's that waterway that flows. So So it's a big kind of landscape that's potentially been polluted. This is a culvert that had a beautiful thistle growing in front of it. It's over here. It's not even associated with any of our waterways that we're targeting. And yet I was really kind of I got attracted by bumblebees. I'm very, it's like squirrels. So I started looking at this thistle and I started to notice something very interesting. I've never seen this before. Insects, when you study entomology and you study pesticides, you understand that not all insects are susceptible to the same chemicals. Some are very robust, some are very sensitive. In this thistle, every single order of insect was represented again. I had flies, I had green lacewings, I had ants, I had wasps, like frozen in time. They were feeding on it or interacting with this thistle and it died. But I've never seen anything like this in the field before. And this was not in one of our culverts that we were targeting. So the problem with kind of estimating exposure is it's not equal across a landscape. When these chemicals enter the landscape, the amount that is being expressed in the plant is going to vary depending on if it's a herbaceous plant or a woody plant. Some of the trees show higher levels. It's also going to be different between pollen and nectar. And so it's very hard to estimate what is your relevant exposure level when you have all these different plants in the system and all these different mechanisms of how these chemicals can enter. Well, our main focus is trying to figure out what exactly is in the nectar and the pollen and where are they getting it. If the leaves are showing 5,000 ppb, what does that mean? So this is, I wanted to show this. I have another slide for this. This is the March image of that water, of that flooding event. It was just a rain event. But notice how all the water just kind of runs through here. And then a month later, what shows up? All this beautiful forage that the bees potentially are then, or any, pollinator wildlife are going to. This is my main concern. Surprisingly, after all the decades of research that we've collected in terms of residue showing up in non-target flowers, there is no regulatory division at EPA to synthesize or take in that data. There's no division within EPA looking at how to reduce the risk and exposure of chemicals that show up in plants. There's robust regulations to control contaminants from going into the water, into the soil, and into the air. But there's nothing in place for when these chemicals start to translocate into the plants. And that's where we really need to push regulators to start addressing. In terms of the colonies, I'm seeing bees with their tongues in the food cells dying inside the frames. These videos are very choppy, so I'm not going to show all of them, but I do want to show this one. I'm finding bees inside the plant tissues. This is a method of water collection. They're getting that glutation drop. But look at this. Do you guys remember sampling you remember catching butterflies running around with your net and then you have to really be kind of spry and agile? Some of these are so cognitively knocked out, you're plucking them off of plants. It's very strange. When you talk to the EPA, they have this response here that basically says that the use of the wet cake and the wastewater as a soil conditioner, they can't conclude that these methods will not result in unreasonable adverse effects on humans or the environment. That was their conclusion. But that can't be the end of the story. It has to be something done about it, which leads us to what's happening now. So the 6 companies that utilize this facility for disposal have taken on charge of cleaning it up. And in Nebraska, we have a voluntary cleanup program where a polluter can go in and clean their mess up and avoid some of these litigation issues. However, there's some concerns about how they're cleaning it up. The first thing is they consolidated the 3 piles of waste into one, and then they, via helicopter, put a polyshell covering over it. which is great for dust off, but not so great for all the leaching underneath. And so that is something that's still not being addressed. If we look at it from an aerial view, here's that wonderful poly shell. Here are the 3 lagoons. Interestingly enough, if you have damaged lagoons and liners that are damaged, the pesticide or the liquid can go down into and displace the liner upward. So what's happening is there's a lot of hydrogen sulfide and methane gases going up, causing the liner to bloat. And they call these whales, it's our Nebraskan whale. But you can see how much of it is kind of floating up to the surface. But that was a problem this fall. These are aerial shots of the lagoons and these whales starting to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So this is what they did. They went in there with this machine and punctured it and sucked the gas out. It was a very interesting process. And then as a result, I think that has led to lagoon leakages because the deflating happened in October, and at that time the lagoons were full and they were at 20 feet. And then all of a sudden they started to drop in 5 feet and then another foot. And so the liquid started to just recede. So that was a huge concern, and some of the publicly available data show that there is contamination in the groundwater, and I think these are pretty high levels. This is at 30 feet, and this is at 50 feet. It's in the water column. So the seed companies have helped with cleaning it up on site. There are some issues about that, but the other TIPSA. The pesticide. Thank you. I was having a hard time with acronyms. They are revamping their disposal of pesticide treated seed recommendation as an industry. There it is. They created a special task force to gather the state contacts, compile these information about the disposal facilities, and then they're trying to provide clear guidance on how to dispose of it. But this is the problem that we still come into. With the treated article exemption, when in the life of a seed do you then designate it back into a hazardous waste product? So there's no designation. I think an easy low-hanging fruit is the expiration date. Put a darn expiration date on the bag. Once it's expired based on viability, then it's waste. But because of that exemption is in place for a whole year. The company was arguing that they do not produce hazardous waste. They produce an economically viable product that farmers want because they can use it as a soil conditioner. So it's not waste. They're still going through litigation, and I don't know too much about it, but this is part of my research site. There's wet cakes distributed all over. There's our bees here. There's the main path flow. This is the farmer who, I don't know if that video is working right. This is a farmer who owns the pond 6 miles down. It's a big body of water, but has had multiple fish kills. And I just want to point out the fact that when we found out more information about this, we didn't have enough data to actually produce a USDA grant proposal. We just had concerns. We had red flags. So Project APHIS M, I want to put a plug in because they're a unique funding source that allows us to get critical gap funding for when we find these emergency problems. We can submit our proposals to them and they can kind of consider it. For USDA, EPA, some of these federal granting opportunities, there's a once a year deadline for that. So you have to wait several months for that deadline in order to submit something. If you don't have enough preliminary data for that, you're going to have a really low chance of getting funding. So you have to wait for another year in order to get data, then to submit a proposal. So I want you guys to just consider the fact that this Project APHIS M is incredibly critical in helping us provide resources so we can keep the data collection going. And this includes, they found a pair of dead beavers in his pond too. It's real sad. So here's the setups. needed the funding to get more bees because it's very expensive to keep putting bees out to die. And to get more equipment, it's new equipment. We've been sampling pollen, nectar, flowers all throughout the site. It's a very tedious process. We're looking to try to identify the plants. We're looking to find the loads. There are definitely pretty high levels of these neonicotinoids in the pollen, but luckily not so much in the nectar. And that's probably because if it's highly contaminated, they have to consume it into their honey stomach to bring it home. If it's that contaminated, they're not coming home. So that's a plus side, that we don't see a lot of these contaminants in the honey. It's mostly in those pollen spores. So in terms of the wet cake, the solid wet cake, we did test one of these properties that had unspread wet cake 2 years later, 2 years after application. It still had pretty high levels of neonicotinoids and fungicides. What was really interesting is that the fungicides seem to be sequestered to the top layer of soil, where a lot of the neonicotinoids were at the bottom stratosphere, and it's either they get photodegraded or they're moving down with the water. But still pretty high levels. The good news here is that over the years, we went from 1,000 to 1,500 dead bees. This year, we're finding very low. So it's starting to recover in terms of the colony levels. Here's another, this is not the updated one, where's my other be? Anyways, 2018, we had 12 colonies, they all died. Then 2019, they all died. 2020, they all died. 21 was a year that they shut down, and we actually started to see colonies that could actually live through the season. And then this year. Another Plopregus M. This is Rogan Tokash. He is my master's student. He was a recipient of the Christy Hines Memorial Scholarship, which allowed him to fund some of these observation hive studies. And then he's been this year's recipient for the Pam Costco Scholarship. Unfortunately, he's going to finish his PhD in Auburn with Jeff Williams, but that's how it goes. Good students you want to encourage to kind of go around. So what did his research show? So he paint marked these bees every 3 days and introduced them to the colony. He got lots of different painted cohorts, 4 observation hives per site, 2 treatment sites, and we're just basically taking bees from one site and moving them into 2 sites. So our site is our treatment. And then 4 reps. And he looked at all of these behaviors at these different age groups. And you can see that there are some stark differences in the amount of nurse bees doing brood care at one site versus another, the red being NREC, the blue being our control farm site. If we look at it kind of with age on the bottom and cumulative number of workers performing behavior, again, he's showing this huge significant difference in the amount of bees doing brood care at that critical brood care stage. He also is finding some really interesting work that look at how early the foraging is occurring. As if we lose foragers out in the environment, younger bees have to take on that foraging role. And this is a huge difference in the time of foragers. We know that precocious foraging also shortens the bee's lifespan, so their longevity is reduced. So I think there's some stark differences here. The other really interesting project that he did was look at queen room capacity. He set up 4 frame moves. And he basically just had a frame of eggs and larvae, an empty comb. And this is from our research lab. 5 minutes, thank you. I'm almost done. And then he had a set where it was, let's say, clean resources, and then a set with dirty resources. These are resources from our dead outs. So he's basically just putting in 2 pounds of bees, eggs, larvae, and looking to see how well they can replace their queen. That's critical in some of these landscapes that are stressful. And he did 4 reps of this, but I don't think he has his fourth one analyzed. But out of 104 total nucleus colonies, 2 sites, pretty stark difference in their ability to produce a functional queen. Now, this is not dirty comb where the eggs were. The eggs and those 2 blue frames are from a common source. So something is happening where they are consuming those dirty food stores, processing it, either it's in the hypopharyngeal gland or it's affecting their brood care. But it is certainly a pretty stark difference in terms of how well a colony can replace their own queen. So I'm gonna finally just kind of end with some of this stuff. This is what we're calling systemic pesticide pollution. Systemic pesticide pollution could be coming from the water, the soil, moving into the plants, expressed in nectar, leaves, and pollen. But I want to reinforce that right now there's no regulatory division at EPA to address this kind of pollution. For beekeepers who are interested in talking about this to the public, I can tell you that working with the legislators, telling them about bee losses, they don't really care. I hate to say it, but you talk to them, they know bees are important, but I'm trying to frame this differently. Okay, so this is a wonderful graph from a review article. These are all the different types of organisms out there. This is a nice review of how they become exposed, either through the dirt, through the plant, through the air, or through air, or through water. Our bees are going to be exposed more to air and plants, but aquatic animals will be, concerned with the water quality. We look at this to try to determine who's at highest risk through the pesticide testing of the vegetation, the plants, the sampling. We know that these insect pollinators are more sensitive after low doses and acute exposure, but these higher order animals are not. They're not as sensitive to these compounds, but there's a lot less known about them at the community level. Why I bring this up is because a lot of people don't really care about bees, but if you frame this as bioindicator species, what you see is if bees are sensitive, bees are dying off, look at what their critical ecosystem role is. It's not just pollination, it's also food web support. So what are all these animals depending on? A lot of these are arthropods that they're depending on. So the fish kill might be directly from the pesticide, or it might be the loss of all the invertebrates, their food source. So that's what we've been doing a lot. We've been trying to emphasize the fact that this needs to be broken down in environmental impact monitoring, but then we also need to look at the ecological and the human domestic animal screening. So it's a huge endeavor. I don't really make headway with just bees, but I make a lot more progress with a huge team of experts saying a similar message, saying that, oh, this is a risk to humans. We're seeing residues in bird eggs. We're seeing, residues in places we didn't expect to see. So it is a lot more effective to pair up, to look at some of these broader challenges. And I think the results of it has been really overwhelming. Even though it's local, we've got these national implications. People are now starting to reevaluate, why do we even need treated seed? Are there options? Where is it working? Where is it not? What systems can we reduce it in? Where can we secure them where they're actually needed? And then this is just kind of showing some of the legislation that we've been kind of working on. And this is people reaching out to us because of what's happening in Nebraska. They want to know, how can our state protect against having this come into their state? So they've been doing a lot of what we call these extended producer responsibility bills, where they are making the industry responsible for their product from cradle to grave. Meaning if they're not being used, they should be in charge of disposing it. Return it back to the company and then figure out a proper way of doing it. So just wanted to end with the fact that there's ongoing litigation in ALTIT as well as EPA, and that's it. So
We have time for a couple questions.
So I was wondering, if you're fighting this in milkweed, if you found some dead monarch caterpillars, could you get them under the Endangered Species Act?
we have found dead monarchs.
And that's Nebraska's part of a monarch corridor. So I'm wondering if you could use the Endangered Species Act to.
We don't have enough data to show, because when you find a dead monarch, right, a lot of these chemicals are not exactly affecting them in a way that they get exposed and they die. We have to rule out or determine whether or not that monarch larva died of a disease. And with the bees, it's very similar. It's not that they're directly killing them, but they sure are making them more susceptible or weaker to other things. So how do we tease that out and say, well, this was the trigger and here are the ramifications? Takes a lot more effort, a lot more sampling.
Okay, one more question.
Yeah.
On your maps, it showed a river to the east.
Yes.
What river is that?
Platte.
And that joins up with the Mississippi?
Yes.
Missouri.
Missouri.
Which hits the
And then there's,
Yeah.
And neonics are water soluble.
They are
Yes.
definitely.
What do you know what the half-life of neonics are?
It depends on the soil, and where depending on where you're talking about, there's varying numbers of half-life. Like if talking about persistence in soil, if you've got soil that tends to be more organic in matter, there's a lot more of that, then they can persist in soil longer. If it's more sooty or sandy, they'll percolate faster. But a lot of times they say, well, if it's in the soil, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going into the plants. So there's still kind of gray areas about the environmental state of these compounds. How much of it in the soil actually transfer into the plants?
And water is different than soil.
Yes, and water is different than soil. How much of the chemicals in the water move into the soil? We don't know that yet either.
So are you the only one doing research? Are you the only one doing the research?
We have a whole big team that
I mean,
can try,
but
yeah,
your team
yeah.
is basically the ones doing research.
Yes, yeah, and it is very tough. It is very tough because nobody wants to fund it. This is an area where it's kind of industrial, environmental, and agriculture, and funding sources like to have really distinct priorities in their funding. So you kind of have to play the game, okay, well, where does this fit? And a lot of people just don't like to spend money on pesticides testing, which is
Okay.
where all the funding goes.
Let's thank Judy one more time. Next speaker is Dr. Nick Nager. Nick is at home because he has COVID, but he's still presenting. So hopefully cross your fingers, the projector will work better than it did last time. Brandon. Hey, Brandon.
Yeah.
So you can sit up, Nick.
Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know.
They're going over to see it.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
Resrad is used in a lot of. Which is a lot of. I don't know. I don't know.
I didn't have the science. There's another one underneath it. Is there another computer underneath it?
Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
You have that sheet with all the task codes?
I never had one. Maybe Martina.
Good question. Missouri, and the Mississippi, but then there's a Gulf of Mexico, and pretty